Optimizing your training often gets a bad rap in the fitness industry. If you recommend an exercise that's more complex than pick up weight, do exercise, then all of the armchair experts fly out of the woodwork with,
I'll have you know, Tom Platz didn't train like that.
Jokes aside, bodybuilding has come on leaps and bounds since the Arnie days, believe it or not. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at ways you can optimize your training to maximize muscle growth without being a complete nerd about it. So if your goal is to maximize muscle growth, which hopefully it is if you're watching this video, then you'd benefit massively from making the majority of your exercises as stable as you can. So first of all, it'll be hugely important to take a look at what stability actually is. In any given exercise, there are forces that are trying to push or pull you in all different directions. Creating stability just allows us to remove as many of those forces as we can, so we're left with the one force that we actually want to have. Now, a lot of machines will have built-in mechanisms that actually do the majority of the stabilizing for us. Think knee pad on a lat pull down, or handles on a leg extension, or even a chest support on a seated row. Now you can imagine if we take any of these away, the output we can produce in the target muscle is considerably less. So it should be pretty easy to see that the more stable an exercise is, the more we can focus on the output of that target muscle and a singular task at hand. There are definitely levels to this, and we could get carried away looking at every restraint we could possibly use, but generally there'll be one force that we want to get rid of and one force that we actually want to keep. So we're going to look at 3 exercises where we can introduce stability to maximize the output of the target muscle. Number 1 is the dumbbell lateral raise. Number 2 is the cable rope crunch. And number 3 is a leg extension or a seated hamstring curl. So when we go through the motion of a lateral raise, we're fighting the downward motion of the dumbbell, but also you can see those dumbbells are going to be pulling me forward. What you'll also see is people just fucking launching their dumbbells about and attempt to lift as much weight as possible, when ideally we want the shoulders to be doing as much of the work as possible. So first of all, we're going to set up a bench to a very slight decline. You're almost certainly going to need to reduce the load that you're using here, but if you know anything about muscle growth, you'll know that the specific load we're using has little influence on muscle growth anyway. So now you can see that that force that was pulling me forward is now completely handled by the bench, meaning that I can fully focus on using my shoulders to take me through that full range of motion. So next up is the cable crunch. Now this is a pretty popular exercise, but the main mistake that I generally see being made here is that when someone comes into the crunch motion, they end up looking like they're doing something closer to a RDL as opposed to a crunch motion. One of the immediate fixes you can use to start doing this exercise a little bit more effectively is just to spin around, get the hips pressing into the bar, and you actually have something push the hips into. Now, we could actually go one step further than that and use something like a lat pull down, where we can have that knee support pushing into our lower back. So now we can focus purely on that curling motion. However, the one caveat with this exercise is that when we get a little bit heavier, we have to fight much harder to keep down into the seat, as the weight is actually pulling us upwards. Now, what we can do to fix this is just whack some heavy dumbbells under the feet. Now we can much more effectively perform the crunch motion. And finally, the good old leg extension. Now, as mentioned previously, this machine already has some stability options built in through the handles, but if you've used a leg extension before, you know that sometimes when that weight gets a little bit heavy, that you are pulling harder into those handles than you are pressing through your legs. And you can see if we weren't to use the handles at all, as I press into my legs, what wants to happen is my hips want to come up off the seat. Now, we can use something like lifting straps, which is going to remove a lot of that grip element into the seat, but to take it one step further, we can actually use a resistance band. So you can see here, I've attached a resistance band nice and heavy to the bottom of the seat, and it's actually pulling me downwards, which is going to help me to stay in the seat a lot easier, so I can focus purely on using my quads in the leg extension. Now, if you'd like to invest in something a little bit easier to set up, you can actually get a seat belt, which can go around the back of the belt and clasp in, which works 10 times better because you can get this a lot tighter. Obviously, not all of your exercises have to be this stable. There are obvious benefits to having exercises that are less stable, like a bent over row or a RDL, to help train our erectors as well. But generally, choosing an exercise that is more stable is going to allow us to maximize the growth for that target muscle. Exercise selection is a very individualized process. We should be picking exercises that suit your goals and your structure. Far too often are people doing exercises purely because everybody else does them. The major example of this is the back squat. Here's a clip of myself and a colleague performing a back squat. So for a basic starting point, you can see how different both of these squats look from a movement perspective. Sam is taller than I am and has a considerably different ratio of torso to leg length than I do. You can see Sam's squat starts off far more hinge-like, almost mimicking a RDL or a deadlift. This is due to Sam having a much longer femur in relation to his torso. For Sam to reach depth, which he already told me in this video was his absolute max depth, he has to drive his hips backwards and lower his chest together. This is going to pretty largely influence the muscles recruited here. Sam will have a much more large bias towards his glutes, whereas I'll much more easily recruit the quads due to my center of gravity and my overall depth. This is why back squatting for Sam probably won't be a great choice to grow his quads, but will be a great option to grow his glutes. Another key factor to consider is how much stimulus we're actually getting from the target muscle in each of our exercises. Again, if your goal is building muscle, then ideally what we want from each of our exercises is to reach as close to muscular failure as we can from the target muscle under the same conditions, i.e. maintaining the same form and the same position throughout the entire exercise. Now, if we take the back squat, for example, the odds that we reach muscular failure because of the quads is actually very slim. What you'll also see in a back squat is as we approach failure, it becomes a lot more difficult to maintain a position that allows us to bias the quads throughout the entire range of motion. Now, this isn't always the case, but it generally takes a lot higher skill level to be able to do this. But if we take an exercise like a hack squat, for example, the odds that we reach muscular failure because of the quads is actually really high. This is because as you push into those final few reps, the machine is doing most of the stability work for us, meaning that it's actually quite tough to move into a less favorable angle. Now, another example is a dumbbell row. So you'll find that in this exercise, that if I was to go into the hinge position, the majority of people will probably fatigue first by having to maintain this hinge position before the back muscles actually end up fatiguing themselves. So a much smarter option here might be to get into a chest supported row. As you can see, this actually allows me to focus purely on the rowing position and not have to worry about doing any of the stabilizing. Now, I'm not saying that a dumbbell row without a chest support is a bad exercise. You're essentially getting some erector stuff, some core stuff, and that's great. If that's your goal, you're essentially killing two birds with one stone. But if your goal is purely muscle growth, then you will benefit massively from finding these stability options in the long term of your training. Now, I fully believe that training to failure is a skill that takes a very long time to master. You need to be willing to put yourself in uncomfortable situations to ultimately allow you to grow. Fucking hell, that would be a good tattoo. Research shows us that the closer we train to failure, the more muscle growth we should expect to see, which is why learning your limits is such an essential step in the process. Now, I feel like it's important to run through what failure is and what that actually looks like. Failure can be defined as the involuntary slowing of rep speed to the point the muscle can no longer produce force to overcome the weight. Not what your parents think of you making YouTube videos to nobody. We often have two categories of this: volitional failure, which is the point where you believe you finished the set, and momentary failure, the point where you physically cannot get another rep. One of the main methods we use for predicting failure is something called reps in reserve. This is basically how many reps away from failure we believe that we were. For example, if I stopped 5 reps away from complete failure, that would be a 5 RIR. Again, there's a body of research showing that the further away we are from failure, the less accurate we are at actually predicting how many reps we had left. So I'd highly recommend starting with some low skill exercises like a bicep curl or a leg extension. So start by performing some reps. Try to keep range of motion as similar as you can across the entire set and perform the reps until you physically cannot move those weights regardless of your effort level. Now, you'll very likely experience an intense burning sensation, especially on a leg extension. Now, this is traditionally where a set may be stopped, but isn't true muscular failure, and we can push past it. It just requires a lot of intent and a lot of determination. Yes, this will hurt. Yes, you will look like you're chomping on a sour lemon. No, not all of your sets need to look like this, but yes, you should expect some serious results over the long term. With this training approach, we can expect to perform less overall sets as long as those sets are accompanied by a rest time of about 3 minutes. So get out there, grab yourself a training partner, start pushing those limits, and I guarantee you will see progress in the long term. If we want to make actual progress, we first need to define what progress actually is, and we need to have methods to track those measures. Some of the most common frustrations I've experienced in many consultations with lifters is that A, they feel like they have no structure or clear path of what it is they're actually doing. B, they feel like they aren't making any progress in what they are currently doing. And C, they feel like they aren't following the best path that's suited for them as an individual. Now, most of these issues come from things like program hopping, instead of finding a program that works and sticking to it as long as possible. And even when people do stick to a program, they tend to not have any tracking measures in place. So they've got no metrics to show that they are actually making progress over the long term. Usually when I ask, what are they not making progress in? Do they have any physical metrics they can prove to me? I'm usually left with some very blank expressions or just a notepad with barbell bench press 3x10 written down. Number 1, create a program with exercises you actually enjoy and exercises that suit your specific body structure and your goals. Number 2, follow this program for a minimum of 12 weeks. Make minor adjustments to exercises that aren't working, but try and keep the structure at its core. Number 3 is to create an easy to access, well laid out tracking system that tracks all of your main lifts and aim to make the smallest possible progressions in each week of your training. Number 4 is to use a consistent tracking measure of intensity, something like RPE or RII, which we mentioned before, to allow for consistency in your training log. And finally, take as many measurements as you can. These are things like body weight measurements, we have progress pictures, we have scale weight, we have tape measurements. All of these are going to be vital for long-term tracking and for you to be able to actually see that there is progress being made over the long term. Don't get caught up in the overly glamorized world of fitness where everything is made to look as epic as it possibly can. Stick to what suits you, what's measurable, and most importantly, what is enjoyable to you. Let me know down below in the comment section if you think that I've missed anything or if there's anything you'd like me to develop on. And if you need any help with anything that we've mentioned in today's video, I will be more than happy to get in the comment section, in my DMs or whatever, to give you some advice. Thank you for watching the whole video, and I will catch you in the next one.